are continuing with a show that we started last week featuring Jeff Henley, who is the author of a book entitled Beyond Reasonable Doubt, A Lawyer's Case for Disbelief in God. And so please join us for the rest of the segment. Another thing about the just God is that you have, in one chapter 9, it said, God waits eons to condemn bystanders.
You know, a fundamental component of again, criminal law is probably the best example in most of these cases, although later in the book I talk about contracts and torts a little bit more. But criminal law is, by far parallels, biblical sanction the most, the closest. And a fundamental facet of our jurisprudence in the United States and in individual state jurisdictions, I'm confident New York has a specific jury charge, is mere presence at the scene of a crime is not evidence of your guilt.
Right.
Mere presence at the scene of a crime is not evidence of your guilt. Now, neither you nor I, at least I'm pretty confident of this, were present in this biblical Garden of Eden.
Right.
So we weren't even present. In our own jurisprudence, you can't even condemn somebody for being present. In this particular case, we weren't even present. And it's not like this is something that happened yesterday, or rather is alleged to have had yesterday, or a year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. We're talking about millennia. And in our law, when I talk about waiting eons, we have problems with time.
Right.
And in our country and other enlightened countries, we have statutes of limitations.
Yes.
We have latches. And the reason why behind and I probably should have explained this a little bit better in terms of one of these things, is if you wait way too long to charge somebody of an offense, whether it's a civil or a criminal charge, there are all kinds of problems that occur. Memories blur, evidence gets destroyed, people's ideas about how something transpired gets blurred. The other thing that it does is it creates opportunity for fraud.
Yep.
If I can charge you for something, say 15 years ago, you're going to be like, well, I don't really. Oh, yeah, you must be guilty if you can't remember why. Because that's what would take place back in common law England, that sometimes people would wait a really long time to make a grievance against somebody that they didn't like, and there was inadequate. The defendant had an inadequate ability to defend himself. And so we just, by our society, have decided that certain actions, if you feel that you're aggrieved, whether you got hit by a car or maybe somebody cheated you out of some money in a contract, that you have a specified period of time to go, okay, I'm going to make a demand of payment if I can, and if they're not going to pay me or do whatever, then I'm going to resort to the court system, or the law enforcement will resort to the court system.
What's that expression? Justice delayed is justice denied.
That's certainly one application of it. There are a number of other applications. Right. Frequently, what they're talking about is just the delay in the court system,
right.
Because sometimes if you can tie somebody up for months or years, you can effectively win.
Yeah, because I was thinking that when you said that before, that the other side of being charged 15 years later is because of what you said earlier about memory fades, evidence disappears, and stuff like that. Somebody who's guilty can probably also use that same.
That's right.
Period of time to weasel out of it.
Yes, and equity. There's a doctrine in equity called equity does not reward people who sleep on their rights.
Right.
So if you've been aggrieved, then you need to do something about it. And it's not like we're saying you only have a week to do it.
Right.
We're not saying that you have to do it in a month. 2 years for some things, 5 years for other things. Bigger crimes or things that are difficult to discover. We have what's called the discovery rule. But when you again use that same sort of logic and you go to the Old Testament, we're talking millennia.
Yeah.
And we're talking about not only are we talking about a long distance of time or a long period of time, but we're talking about a change of circumstances, even by the face of the Scripture itself. I mean, so okay, let's assume for the sake of argument that there was an Eden, there was an apple or serpent, and all these breaches occurred. And then as you pick up in Genesis where God suddenly becomes angry about the number of women who are fornicating with fallen angels.
Yeah.
And then we have the big flood. Well, okay, fine. Let's just assume, again, you have to assume, and I know if this burden of disbelief is overwhelming you, then I can sympathize. But let's just take that in the best light possible and assume it's true. Well then, okay, he destroys the world. What on earth can you possibly say about original sin now when you repopulate it? And this was what the doctrine in common law called latches. Not just the passage of time, but the passage of time mixed with some intervening event that now changes the circumstances so that the rationale for achieving this for rewarding the aggrieved party no longer exists.
Right. So
theoretically, God could have just populated the earth with new super followers who don't violate His creed.
Right, or just innocent people generally. Whatever,
right.
That's true. But I've noticed as well that in original sin aside, that all through the Bible, it's replete with, even without the delay, that whenever there's some major action taken, that innocent people get punished anyway, even when justice is immediate.
Right, and he even says that all the creeping things, all the things
right.
in the sea, and even animals which don't even have any real use. Right. I'm going to go ahead and take them out anyway. And it's like there's no sense of proportionality. And that's another fundamental facet of our judicial system.
Right.
Eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. Those were draconian, but they were still very early efforts to give some sense of proportionality. Now,
yes.
In our case, that would be just grossly unrefined and too severe, but still, it's a crude effort at proportionality.
Yeah.
Our own system of justice is extremely proportional. Even the federal sentencing guidelines, which have been lambasted for specific offense, the drafters of the committee and the judges who impose them make an effort to try to tailor the punishment for the crime, as opposed to just going ahead and wiping out a block of innocents as well as culpable parties.
Well, look, one example in the Old Testament would be where Joshua's armies go into Canaan, to the Midianites, and they basically slash pregnant women and dash babies' heads against the rocks, and take pubescent girls, sex slaves, and are allowed to pillage the temples and all that, and because basically their parents did believe the right God.
Right.
And it's not just that. I mean, other innocent people are slaughtered constantly.
What in fact we probably do know is that stuff like that did occur because it's just purely Darwinian competition. I'm going to take these people out because, hey, they're a rival tribe. But what's so offensive in this context is, this God commanded it. This God
right.
willed it. This God made it happen and made it and authorized it.
Right.
I talk at length about the Ten Commandments, and I talk about the sacrificial legislative history of the Ten Commandments, mm-hmm. because after the followers had sort of they made the statue to Baal or Baal and Moses is angry and he comes down and he's got some new commandments, but before that he sets the Levites on them and they kill 3,000 people.
Right.
Because they made that idol and now they violated God's word. And so and the reason why I talk about sacrificial legislative history, I mean one of the things that we do in the law is we don't just look at the plain text. We look at the events or the debates that took place in terms of drafting a piece of legislation. Mm-hmm. I mean, you've probably heard this expression before. What does Congress and butchers have in common? You don't want to watch the process of a bill being made. It's like sausage, being ground through,
right,
and
right.
all the debating and the compromises and things that are taking place. Well, the legislative history of the Ten Commandments, at least the second one, is 3,000 dead people.
Yeah.
But that's the explicit message. That is. Right. I mean, compare that with, as I do, with what our founders did. They met in Philadelphia, although in secret. although there was some controversy even in the ratification process. But they these groups of disparate interests, North and South, merchant and agriculture, stock jobber and planter, and slave and freehold represented interests, and they hashed it out. And they came up with a pretty, frankly, I think it's an astounding document. Of course,
absolutely, probably one of the most radical documents ever produced. And
it's durable, it's functional. Obviously, it wasn't perfect. I mean, the three-fifths compromise and a couple of other things were atrocious, but they were compromises that had to take place because it just wasn't going to go down.
Right.
But that is an example of a true, deliberative, sensible process that's more than apparent didn't take place with the Bible. I mean,
right. Aside from the fact that, for instance, the example I gave before of Joshua's armies going in and slaughtering the Midianites, first of all, aside from the fact that there's actually no real evidence that ever took place,
right?
But like you say, it is Darwinian in that all cultures were doing that at the time and before anyway. But what has happened is that that particular myth was grafted onto the Hebrew myth for specific purposes, and the whole purpose was to worship the Lord because He's a badass, and you're going to get in trouble if you don't.
Right.
It was in Hebrew that Hebrew myth. That theme occurs later on. For instance, when they're bringing the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem, and on the wagon, I guess the Ark goes over a stone or something, and the Ark starts to fall over, and one of the drivers actually reaches out and touches the Ark and dies immediately because it was so holy that you weren't supposed to touch it. Well, the only purpose, of course, was to show what a badass God is. You just don't touch that Ark,
Don't save it.
Yeah. I mean,
let the ground get punished.
well, no. When I first heard that story, my action was, well, hey, if you ever see the Ark of the Covenant fallen somewhere, you just leave it in the dirt. Just walk away. And what was, I'm getting slightly off topic, but somewhat off topic. But what is the moral example that, other than God is a badass, because what would have been the right thing to do?
Right.
To let it fall and just,
absolutely,
and then what? You build a temple where it's landed, or whatever. What other moral lesson than to put the fear of God into people?
Right, and that's something that takes place throughout Scripture because where you're supposed to not eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Lot's wife turns into a pillar of salt when she looks back to see what God is doing.
But that myth, by the way, has a similar myth in Greek mythology.
Oh, sure. Right.
As well.
Absolutely.
As well.
But the whole is that you're punished when you inquire. Believe in me. Don't believe in me. Believe without seeing. Don't ask why. Right. And again, that too is completely out of the ocean, particularly American jurisprudence, because our American jurisprudence, I'm not sure if you know that we're on an adversarial model. Mm-hmm. We believe it's almost kind of like a marketplace analogy. We believe in two people.
So you were saying that the American jurisprudence involves an adversarial system where either the state and the individual, or two individuals, or two corporations, or two opposing sides kind of work it out through the law. Is that
right? They either mediate an agreement or duke it out in court. And the idea is each side is competing to provide its version of the truth, its account, and to make it more palatable or more believable to the fact finder, whether it's a judge or a jury. And frankly, I think it's a great model.
Yeah.
I think because what it tells you is each side better try hard to make its case sensible. And if you don't have a sensible case, then you don't put it forward, and you go and you cut a deal and you negotiate based upon the weaknesses or the strengths of your case. The European model is different in the sense that they call it the Inquisitorial System, and that's where the judge, as opposed to the state, for example, in criminal cases, is bringing the case by itself, and you end up kind of dealing, as a singular entity, both judge and prosecutor. And here, again, in America, it's more of a referee standard. Two teams meet on the field, and whose story makes the most sense, is going to be the one that carries the day. And that's something that we don't have in the Bible at all. There is no competing account. In fact, I have a significant depiction about Satan in there, or Beelzebub, or the Prince of Darkness, the devil, Scratch, all this evolutionary process, because they call him the adversary in one point in time, and the question is he a singular entity in some senses, or is he an agent of God, or is he something that, I kind of compare him to the that traveling team with the Harlem Globetrotters that always has to lose.
Right.
And we just bring the adversary out here so we can beat up on him a little bit, and then we bring him, we put him back, and then we bring him out later on.
Well, yeah, and that, we could do a whole show on that alone, how, for instance, the role of Satan has changed, is morphed over the years.
Absolutely.
Because actually, I think when Satan is first mentioned, certainly in the book of Job, Satan is kind of like drinking buddies with God.
Absolutely. I compare them to, do you remember Trading Places?
Yes.
Duke and Duke. You had Mortimer, or the Duke brothers, talking about what they could do to, in essence, Jacob, or Lot, rather, or Job, rather, of the Dan Aykroyd character.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, this is what we could do. If we wrecked his life, got him unemployed, and took his woman away, then maybe he might succumb into a life of crime. But just like in the book of Job, it's incremental.
Yeah.
And it keeps on coming skein for skein. If you don't, you're going to be able to do more than just afflict him by taking his stuff. Originally, that's all he could do, and then Satan comes back to him and says, "Well, are you going to let me afflict his body?" "Oh, okay, yeah, go ahead, try it." And then ultimately, the bet comes to a resolution. But it was incremental. Each particular time that Satan was going to afflict him, he had to go back for additional consent from God to advance or increase the intensity of the punishment.
So in effect, Satan was doing God's work.
Absolutely.
Well, and of course, that's aside from the very silliness of the idea that why would God need to put someone through a test if God knows what's going to happen in the future anyway?
Right.
Why would Satan, who later on became God's adversary, enemy of God, what would be the point of making war against an enemy that you knew you couldn't win no matter what?
Well, we do that all the time.
Well, in a human context, there's always a possibility, or you hold out hope. But when you're talking, we don't.
It's preordained that he has to lose, and I agree. That part is stupid, and it's like, and then when they reintroduce Satan in the New Testament with Jesus, and Jesus, it's real Dickensian, like just like the ghost of Christmas past, or leading Scrooge through the ether at night and looking over London. Satan's telling this to Jesus. All this could be yours if you bow down to me. And it's like, wait a second, why would he be asking that or telling you that if Satan knows that you're the Son of God? Why?
Or that you are God.
Depending on who you talk to. I mean, it really is just all these sort of. It's like they're just constantly creating Rubik's cubes just for the sake of it.
Right.
Like, let's throw another puzzle at them, and if they can't figure it out because it's stupid, then we'll just tell them that you don't understand the history.
Well, I think each age and each culture kind of reinvents the myth according to their own style and perception and convenience, and what happens is it just gets layered and layered and layered and layered and layered, and people aren't encouraged, or in fact discouraged, from thinking about it in a larger context anyway. So it's kind of, by the time, if you're a kid born in the 21st century and you're being educated in a religion, you're not going to. You don't have any way of understanding that Satan that you're being taught about today is completely illogical in any kind of larger sense,
Well, and the attachment to time and place.
Yes.
The one that kills me, living in an American democracy, are the titles: Lord, King of Kings.
Yes.
I mean, we know. I mean, those are things that just identify you to a specific time and place. I mean, we did. It wasn't the president, wasn't the dictator. These are ancient monarchical terms that are completely incompatible with our notions of title, which are prohibited in the United States, and frankly, it's just oppressive because and
there's this warm and fuzzy, generally held notion that we have justice today because of religion.
Right.
When in fact, religion has been an obstacle to any kind of justice as we understand it now.
It frequently is. I'm currently working on another book about that addresses ecclesiastical courts.
Yeah.
Because something that's completely foreign. I mean, as much as we kind of, belittle and berate and get, annoyed by modern day theists, things are much better now than they were hundreds of years ago.
Absolutely, of course.
Mean, because ecclesiastic courts, compelled tithing. I mean, the ways that they computed income too were just hysterical. I mean, they actually, they would make sure that they got the best or all the wool accounted for on your sheep, even the stuff that you couldn't use. And the church, as a result, I mean, had exercised control. They didn't in England. They didn't just merely do divorces and family law. They did wills, defamation, bankruptcy, and all weave through all of that they're going to be ascertaining or at least looking at the belief systems of the litigants, and you can bet that a number of people who are more secular then got it handed to them because they weren't right with the local parish.
Right. Especially when it came down to issues like property and things.
Tithing.
Like tithing, and people got.
Well, the according to the scant records that they do have, the church won 80% of all tithing cases. Wow. Imagine that.
Hard to imagine. Oh boy, but again, I can understand. In a certain historical cultural context, holding the Judeo-Christian Bible with a certain level of respect, having to show because it shows how the point we had come from, say, prior to that. As opposed to open tribal warfare and all that sort of thing, or at least attempting to make the case. I can see doing it as showing it as a historical document as to how people thought. And it is, I think, while I don't believe that the Bible is historical, I think it has historical value, but not for the reasons that it's intended. I mean, the style of writing, the references, the political picture in the long run.
Sure.
But to in any way imply that system of law is superior to what we've got now is insanity.
Right.
It's that anything in a secular, any law in a group of laws in a secular democracy that religious law should be deferred to is really insane. It's frightening.
Oh, it is. It is, because the other thing that I'm looking at a lot right now is Sharia law. Sharia is, well, I mean,
that's Muslim. That's Muslim law. For
right.
Anybody.
And I'm not. I don't pretend to be an expert in that because my investigation has just sort of begun in the last several months.
Right.
And but there are a variety of problems with Sharia law. I'm reading this book right now about the problems that take place between Western nations that do oil concessions in nations that were, Islamic, Arabic countries that had oil concessions, because one of the fundamental tenets of Sharia law is that you can't have a contract within a contract. The explanation is pretty lengthy, but it creates massive problems when you're talking about something as complex as an oil concession, when you have a foreign nation coming in and providing technology and perhaps labor and then extracting a particular commodity out of the ground for a long period of time. Of course you're going to have multiple contracts.
Yeah, in this day and age, how can you avoid it?
Absolutely. But yet they try to make suggestions that somehow, well, it's still kind of a flexible doctrine, but their fundamentalists then come back and say, no, it's incompatible. And here's what the problem is. So when those contracts get in dispute, and then you have some sort of, presumably a Western arbitration, because that's usually the way it's been, some sort of Western arbitration come forward to resolve the dispute. Well, sometimes the Arabs will appeal to Sharia law and say, well, the contract was null and void in the first place,
right.
So we're not going to pay you what we owe you.
Yeah.
And so you have to, one of the things that you really want in the law, and American law is very good about this, is you want to create expectancies, and you want to fulfill them.
Yeah.
Because what you want, well, we don't, contrary to popular belief, lawyers, we obviously they want to get paid, but what the idea behind the law is you want the system to work on its own. And here's probably a very concrete example of it. Sometimes, if you've ever served jury duty, jurors are coming to the courthouse and they're waiting around, they're being herded like cattle, they hate it, and for good reason. And then what will happen is a defendant or the parties will settle while the jury's in the hall, or the defendant will plead guilty. And then the judge will call them into court and say, hey, thank you for your service. Wait, we didn't serve. Yes, you did. Because if that guy didn't know that you guys were out in the hallway and that you're about to sit down and decide his guilt and he's going to get popped, then he wouldn't have been brought to the table. And so what we want to do with the law is to create systems that people do what we want them to do without always having to resort to enforcement.
Yeah, right. In any case, I would like to go on further, but we have come to the end of another show. You've been watching New York City Atheists live on tape. Our guest has been Jeff Henley, who is the author of the book, Beyond Reasonable Doubt, A Legal Case for Disbelief in God. Joining us, and I want to thank you for joining us. Please, I've been your host, Dennis Horvitz. You've been watching New York City Atheists live on tape. See you next week.
We once were, we are no longer a Christian nation, at least not just. We are also a Jewish nation, a Muslim nation, and a Buddhist nation, and a Hindu nation, and a nation of non-believers.